The summer heat of 1916 clung to the tenement walls of Mulberry Street like a living thing, thick with the mingled scents of garlic, garbage, and the particular desperation that marked neighborhoods where the American dream felt more like a taunt than a promise. In the narrow alleys between brick buildings that seemed to lean toward each other like gossiping neighbors, young Vito Genovese watched the older boys with the careful attention of a predator studying its future prey. At 15, he possessed the kind of stillness that made grown men uncomfortable, a quality that suggested violence held in reserve rather than any absence of it. 3 years had passed since his arrival from the hill towns of Naples, where poverty had been a fact of life, as unchangeable as the rocky soil. America had promised transformation, but the tenements of Little Italy offered only a different species of hunger. Where Italian poverty had been honest and ancient, American poverty carried with it the peculiar shame of failure in a land that proclaimed itself the home of opportunity. Genovese had learned quickly that in these crowded streets, opportunity wore many faces, and the most profitable were rarely the ones discussed in the settlement houses where social reformers tried to salvage immigrant souls. He stood in the shadow of a fire escape, his dark eyes tracking the movements of 3 men emerging from a social club on the corner. They moved with a particular swagger that marked them as connected, their expensive suits drawing envious glances from laborers still covered in the dust of construction sites and factory floors. One of them, a broad-shouldered Sicilian named Giuseppe Morello, caught Genovese's gaze and held it for a moment that stretched like wire between them. Something passed in that exchange, a recognition that the boy watching from the shadows possessed qualities that might prove useful to men whose business required both loyalty and ruthlessness. The encounter lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but Genovese understood that he had been evaluated and, in some fundamental way, found acceptable. When Morello nodded slightly before turning away, the gesture carried weight that no words could have conveyed. In the weeks that followed, Genovese would begin running errands for the social club, small tasks that tested his discretion and nerve. By his 16th birthday, he would commit his first robbery. By 17, his first murder, though the body would never be found and the victim's name never spoken aloud by anyone who valued their own continued existence. Across the narrow streets that separated ethnic enclaves like invisible borders, Meyer Lansky was learning lessons of an entirely different nature. Born Meyer Sucholyansky in Grodno, a city that belonged to the Russian Empire when he entered the world, but would change hands like currency in a poker game as empires rose and fell. He had arrived in America in 1911 with his family's hopes pressed upon his small shoulders like a physical weight. At 9 years old, he spoke Yiddish and Russian, but barely any English, marking him as fresh off the boat to boys who measured status by the number of generations their families had survived in the New World. The Lower East Side's Jewish quarter hummed with its own particular energy, distinct from the Italian neighborhoods, yet somehow harmonious in shared struggle. Here, pushcart vendors hawked their wares in a dozen languages. Religious schools taught ancient texts to boys who would grow up to inhabit a thoroughly modern world, and the tension between tradition and transformation played out in every household where parents clung to old ways while children rushed headlong toward American futures. Lansky absorbed it all with the quiet intensity that would become his trademark, understanding that survival required more than physical strength or even courage. It required intelligence, the ability to calculate odds and read human nature with mathematical precision. He discovered his gift by accident, or perhaps by the kind of destiny that only reveals itself in retrospect. In a dice game behind a tenement building on Ludlow Street, where older boys gambled their meager earnings from factory work and delivery routes, 10-year-old Lansky watched the patterns emerge like figures in a ledger book. The numbers spoke to him in a language more comprehensible than English, revealing probabilities and outcomes that the other players couldn't see. When he finally joined the game with pennies earned from his after-school job at a tool and die maker's shop, he won consistently enough that accusations of cheating began to surface. But Lansky wasn't cheating, not in any way that could be proven or even explained to boys whose education had ended at the 6th grade. He was simply counting, calculating, understanding that dice and cards followed mathematical principles as immutable as the ones governing the planets. The accusation of cheating faded when an older boy named Benjamin Siegel, whose volatile temper and quick fists had already earned him respect and fear in equal measure, announced that anyone who claimed Lansky was dishonest would have to answer to him. The friendship between the calculating mathematician and the explosive enforcer would prove one of the most durable and profitable in the history of American organized crime, though neither boy could have articulated such grand ambitions in that moment. In East Harlem, where Italian immigration had created another Little Italy distinct from the one downtown, Francesco Castiglia was navigating his own path through the complexities of immigrant life. His family had arrived from Calabria in 1900 when he was 9 years old, making him more American than many of his peers despite the thick accent that would never entirely leave his speech. Where Genovese approached the world with barely contained violence and Lansky with mathematical precision, Castiglia, who would later adopt the more American-sounding name Frank Costello, possessed something rarer and ultimately more valuable, the ability to talk to anyone. He understood instinctively what others struggled to learn through painful experience. That power in America flowed not just through force or cunning, but through connections. The Irish cops who patrolled their neighborhood, the Tammany Hall politicians who promised jobs and favors in exchange for votes, the legitimate businessmen who needed certain services that couldn't be advertised in newspapers. All of them could be cultivated, befriended, made useful. By his teenage years, Costello was already serving as a bridge between worlds that rarely intersected, translating not just between languages, but between the codes that govern different spheres of influence. His first arrest came in 1908 for assault and robbery, a clumsy teenage crime that taught him more through its consequences than through its execution. The courtroom where he stood before a judge who regarded him with weary contempt revealed the machinery of American justice, and Costello studied it the way Lansky studied probability. He noted which lawyers commanded respect, which political connections could make charges disappear, how money changed hands in ways that left no paper trail but altered outcomes with reliable consistency. The conviction and brief jail sentence became his education in the systems that governed their world, and he emerged from it with ambitions that extended far beyond the small-time street crime that satisfied his peers. The year 1920 approached like a storm gathering on the horizon, visible to anyone with eyes trained to read the signs. In Washington, politicians and temperance advocates prepared to impose their vision of moral uplift on a nation that showed little inclination toward sobriety. In Europe, the Great War had ended, sending soldiers home to find that the world they'd fought to preserve had transformed in their absence. And in the tenement neighborhoods of New York, where immigrants clustered together for mutual protection and shared language, young men like Genovese, Lansky, and Costello prepared for opportunities they couldn't yet name, but somehow sensed approaching with the inevitability of changing seasons. They didn't know each other yet, these three who would reshape American organized crime into something unprecedented. Genovese moved through Little Italy's violent underworld, building a reputation for reliability in matters requiring physical courage and moral flexibility. Lansky had formed his partnership with Siegel, running small-time operations that combined Bugsy's willingness to use force with Meyer's gift for planning and execution. Costello was expanding his connections, learning the names of every cop and politician in his district, understanding that information was currency as valuable as the dollars he collected from street corner dice games and small-time protection rackets. But the city that contained them was already pressing these separate elements together, creating the conditions for fusion. In the social clubs, where older men played cards and discussed business in the coded language that kept them ahead of the law, in the speakeasies that would soon proliferate like mushrooms after rain, in the police precincts, where ambitious cops understood that cooperation with criminals could prove more profitable than enforcement of laws, the infrastructure was being built that would support the empire these three would eventually construct. The war in Europe had taught Americans something about the interconnectedness of the modern world, how events in distant capitals could reshape lives in unexpected ways. The coming prohibition would teach a different lesson about the relationship between law and human nature, about what happened when government tried to legislate morality in a nation built on the principle that individuals should be free to pursue their own visions of happiness. For Genovese, Lansky, and Costello, these lessons would prove more valuable than any formal education could have provided. In the narrow streets of the Lower East Side, where the future of America was being written, in the sweat and ambition of immigrant labor, three young men were learning the skills that would define their era. They understood, perhaps better than the legitimate businessmen and politicians who dominated newspaper headlines, that America was fundamentally a nation of opportunity for those willing to seize it. The methods might be illegal, the violence occasionally necessary, the compromises with conscience sometimes troubling. But the dream, the possibility of transformation from poverty to power, remained as American as anything celebrated in the schoolbooks that taught sanitized versions of the nation's history. By decade's end, Genovese would have blood on his hands and a reputation that made grown men step aside when he walked down the street. Lansky would have proven that a Jewish kid from the Lower East Side could operate in the Italian-dominated underworld, that ethnic cooperation could transcend the old hatreds imported from European soil. Costello would have cultivated connections that reached into City Hall and police headquarters, understanding that in America, power was negotiated rather than seized, built through relationships rather than violence alone. The stage was set for a transformation that none of them could yet fully envision. In the social clubs and street corners, in the gambling dens and protection rackets, in the careful cultivation of political connections and the strategic application of violence, the foundation was being laid for something unprecedented. The old ways, imported from Sicily and maintained through blood oaths and ethnic loyalty, were about to collide with thoroughly American principles of efficiency, cooperation, and profit maximization. And in that collision, in the heat and hunger of streets where survival required constant adaptation, three men who didn't yet know each other would eventually find that their complementary talents, violent ambition meeting political sophistication meeting mathematical genius, could create an empire that would endure long after the ethnic neighborhoods that spawned them had transformed into something unrecognizable to the immigrants who first carved out space there. The summer heat would fade into autumn, autumn into winter, and winter into the transformative spring of 1920, when the 18th Amendment would hand them an opportunity beyond anything their teenage selves could have imagined. But for now, in 1916, they were simply three young men among thousands, distinguishable only by qualities that would take years to fully reveal themselves. Genovese's capacity for violence without remorse, Lansky's gift for seeing patterns where others saw only chaos, and Costello's understanding that in America, the most dangerous weapon wasn't a gun, but the ability to make powerful people believe you were indispensable to their success. The winter of 1920 brought more than snow to New York streets. On January the 17th, when the 18th Amendment became law, it carried with it a promise of moral redemption and the unintended gift of empire building for men who understood that America's thirst would not be legislated away. In a basement speakeasy on Delancey Street, where the scent of bathtub gin mingled with sawdust and cigarette smoke, Meyer Lansky sat across from a broad-shouldered Calabrian named Frank Costello, and between them lay the outline of a future neither could yet fully envision. The meeting had been arranged through mutual acquaintances, the kind of careful introduction that characterized business dealings in their world. Lansky, at 19, had already established himself as someone worth knowing, his partnership with Benjamin Siegel producing reliable profits from hijacking and small-scale bootlegging operations. Costello, 7 years older and infinitely more connected to the political machinery that governed New York, saw in the younger man something that transcended ethnic boundaries, a quality that the old guard Sicilians would have dismissed, but that thoroughly American criminals understood instinctively. Competence mattered more than bloodline. They spoke in the careful language of men testing each other's intelligence and discretion. Costello outlined the problem with elegant simplicity. Demand for quality liquor would be enormous, unprecedented, but supply chains remained chaotic, vulnerable to police raids and rival gangs. What was needed wasn't just muscle to protect shipments, though that certainly had its place, but organization, real planning that treated bootlegging as the business it was becoming, rather than the street crime it had been. Lansky listened with the focused attention he brought to everything involving numbers and logistics. His pale blue eyes, which some found unsettling in their intensity, tracked the implications of what Costello was proposing. Canadian distilleries were operating legally, producing whiskey that needed only to cross the border or arrive by boat along the extensive coastline that law enforcement could never adequately patrol. Caribbean rum runners were establishing routes that the Coast Guard lacked the resources to interdict. And in every neighborhood in New York, speakeasies were opening with such frequency that police couldn't possibly shut them all down, even if police corruption hadn't already made enforcement a negotiable proposition. The partnership that emerged from that conversation would prove more durable than either man anticipated. Costello would handle the political arrangements, ensuring that the right police captains and precinct commanders understood that cooperation was more profitable than interference. Lansky would manage the logistics, creating distribution networks that operated with the efficiency of legitimate businesses. And when muscle was required, when competitors needed to be discouraged or shipments protected, they would call on men like Vito Genovese, whose reputation for violence had grown considerably since his teenage years on Mulberry Street. Genovese's path to this moment had been written in blood and calculated brutality. By 1920, he had become indispensable to Joe Masseria, the ambitious Sicilian who was consolidating power in Manhattan's Italian neighborhoods through a combination of strategic alliances and strategic murders. Where other young men in Masseria's organization showed hesitation or squeamishness about certain tasks, Genovese demonstrated a capacity for violence that seemed almost mechanical in its efficiency. He didn't rage or boast about his work. He simply executed orders with the same matter-of-fact competence that a carpenter might bring to building a staircase. The first time Costello brought Genovese into one of their operations, Lansky studied the younger Sicilian with the analytical detachment he applied to all potential assets. What he saw both impressed and disturbed him. Genovese possessed obvious physical courage and the kind of reputation that made negotiations simpler, since everyone knew that disagreements with him tended to end permanently. But there was something else beneath the surface, an ambition that burned with an intensity that might eventually prove problematic. Men who wanted too much, Lansky understood even then, were men who might eventually want everything. Still, in those early years of prohibition, there was more than enough profit to satisfy even ambitious appetites. The money flowed like the liquor they smuggled, transforming street criminals into businessmen whose income rivaled that of legitimate entrepreneurs. Costello moved into better neighborhoods, his suits becoming more expensive, his political connections extending into circles where Italian immigrants had rarely penetrated. Lansky invested his profits with the careful attention to detail that characterized everything he did, understanding that the bootlegging boom wouldn't last forever and that smart men prepared for inevitable transitions. Genovese's wealth manifested differently. He remained in the old neighborhood, but his presence there took on new dimensions. Shopkeepers who had once treated him with wary respect now showed something closer to fear. Local politicians sought his approval for decisions affecting the community. And when disputes arose, increasingly people came to him rather than to the police, understanding that his justice, while sometimes harsh, was at least predictable and untainted by the corruption that made official channels unreliable. The three men's operations intersected with growing frequency through the early 1920s. A shipment coming down from Canada required Costello's political connections. to ensure smooth passage through customs checkpoints, Lansky's logistical planning to coordinate timing and delivery, and Genovese's muscle to protect against hijackers who saw unguarded liquor trucks as irresistible opportunities. None of them would have described their arrangement as a partnership in those years. They were independent operators whose interests occasionally aligned, nothing more. Yet something was taking shape beneath the surface of these pragmatic collaborations, a recognition that their different strengths created possibilities larger than any of them could achieve alone. Costello's genius lay in understanding that American power flowed through institutions, that judges and politicians and police captains were not obstacles to be overcome, but assets to be cultivated. His ability to sit down with a Tammany Hall district leader and emerge with an understanding that benefited both parties, to explain to a police captain how looking the other way could prove more profitable than aggressive enforcement, made him invaluable in ways that simple violence could never match. Lansky brought a different kind of intelligence to their emerging collaboration. Where Costello understood people and politics, Lansky understood systems and probabilities. He could look at a map of New York and see distribution networks, calculate the optimal routes for moving product from warehouses to speakeasies, determine which neighborhoods could support how many establishments before market saturation reduced profits. His ledgers, maintained with mathematical precision, tracked every dollar earned and spent, creating the kind of accountability that legitimate businesses would have envied. And Genovese provided the foundation upon which these more sophisticated operations rested. His reputation meant that hijackers thought twice before targeting their shipments, that competitors understood the consequences of encroaching on their territories, that soldiers within their own organizations knew that disloyalty or incompetence would be addressed with terminal efficiency. The violence he represented wasn't random or sadistic. It was carefully calibrated to achieve specific business objectives, and in that calculation lay its real power. By 1923, the bootlegging operations that had begun as opportunistic ventures were evolving into something approaching corporate structure. Lansky had created a system for tracking inventory that would have impressed executives at Standard Oil. Costello had developed relationships with politicians that extended beyond simple bribery into genuine influence over municipal policy. And Genovese had built an enforcement apparatus that combined street muscle with the kind of organizational discipline that made it reliably effective rather than chaotically violent. The speakeasy on Delancey Street, where Lansky and Costello had first met, became something like an informal headquarters, a neutral ground where various operators could gather to discuss business without the territorial tensions that poisoned other venues. Here, Jewish gangsters sat alongside Italian ones. Irish bootleggers negotiated with Polish rum runners, and the old ethnic divisions that had defined criminal operations for generations began to dissolve in the universal solvent of profitable cooperation. Not everyone welcomed this transformation. The older generation, men who had built their reputations on ethnic loyalty and old-world codes, watched with growing unease as youngsters like Lansky and Costello and Genovese operated according to principles that seemed almost treasonous to traditional ways of doing business. Joe Masseria, Genovese's patron, grumbled about Jews and Irish getting involved in Italian affairs. Arnold Rothstein, the Jewish gambler and fixer who had mentored Lansky, worried that his protégé was getting too close to Sicilians whose violence might eventually prove uncontrollable. But the money was impossible to argue with. By 1924, quality Canadian whiskey was arriving in New York with such regularity that speakeasies could advertise their stock with confidence. Caribbean rum flowed through distribution networks that stretched from Miami to Boston. And the political protection that Costello had carefully cultivated meant that, while occasional raids made newspaper headlines and satisfied public demands for enforcement, the real business continued largely unmolested. The transformation wasn't just financial. Men who had started the decade as street criminals were learning to operate in worlds they had never expected to access. Costello attended political dinners where he sat alongside judges and congressmen, his rough edges smoothed by expensive tailoring and the kind of cultural education that money could purchase. Lansky invested in legitimate businesses, understanding that the respectability they conferred was as valuable as the profits they generated. Even Genovese, whose primary contribution remained his capacity for violence, found himself managing operations that required skills beyond intimidation. The relationship between the three men remained informal, undefined by the kind of explicit agreements that might later be used against them in court. They cooperated when cooperation served their interests, competed when competition seemed advantageous, and maintained the careful distance that men in their profession understood was necessary for survival. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford, but mutual advantage created bonds that proved nearly as strong. In the spring of 1925, a hijacking incident revealed both the strength and fragility of their arrangement. A shipment of premium scotch, jointly financed by operations connected to all three men, was stolen en route from the docks to a warehouse in Queens. The thieves were professionals, well informed about timing and route, suggesting inside information. The loss was significant enough to demand response, but the solution required coordination that their loosely structured partnership wasn't designed to provide. The meeting to address the situation took place in the back room of a restaurant in Little Italy, with Costello, Lansky, and Genovese sitting around a table that bore the remnants of an elaborate meal none of them had eaten with much appetite. The tension wasn't about the money, though the loss was substantial. It was about the implication that their organization, if it could even be called that, had been penetrated by someone who understood its operations well enough to strike at a vulnerable moment. Genovese advocated for the direct approach: find the thieves, make an example that would discourage future theft, move on. His logic was sound in its simplicity. In their world, unpunished theft invited more theft, and reputation was currency as valuable as the liquor that had been stolen. Costello argued for investigation before action, wanting to understand whether this was an isolated incident or part of a larger threat. Lansky said little, his silence carrying its own weight as he calculated probabilities and outcomes. The solution they eventually agreed upon reflected their different strengths working in concert rather than conflict. Costello would use his police connections to learn what official investigations had discovered. Lansky would audit their operations to identify the leak that had made the hijacking possible, and Genovese would handle the inevitable confrontation once the thieves were identified. It was efficient, pragmatic, and demonstrated something that none of them had explicitly articulated. They were most effective when operating as a unit rather than as individuals. The hijackers were found within a week, their fate sealed not by Genovese's violence alone, but by the systematic investigation that had located them. The message sent by their deaths was amplified by Costello's quiet word to other operators that certain shipments enjoyed special protection, and by Lansky's revised security protocols that made future theft considerably more difficult. The incident became, in retrospect, a defining moment in the formation of what would eventually become the most powerful criminal organization in America. As 1925 drew to a close and the Prohibition era approached its midpoint, the three men who would reshape organized crime had found each other without quite realizing the significance of what was forming. They weren't partners, not yet. They hadn't formalized their relationship or defined their roles with the precision that would later characterize their operations. But they had discovered something that the old guard bosses had missed, that in America, ethnic cooperation wasn't just possible, but profitable, that different kinds of intelligence could complement rather than compete, and that the future belonged to men who could adapt to changing circumstances rather than clinging to traditions imported from worlds that no longer existed. The city continued its transformation around them, speakeasies multiplying like cells dividing, politicians growing fat on bribes that bought protection, and ordinary Americans discovering that the government's attempt to legislate morality had created opportunities for those willing to supply what law forbade but nature demanded. And in the smoke-filled rooms where the real business of the city was conducted, three young men were building something that would outlast prohibition, outlast the ethnic neighborhoods that spawned them, and fundamentally alter the relationship between crime and American life. The salt air of Atlantic City carried more than the promise of summer in May 1929. Along the boardwalk, where legitimate businessmen strolled with their families and tourists fed coins into arcade machines, another kind of business was being conducted in hotel suites overlooking the endless Atlantic. In a private dining room at the Ambassador Hotel, where crystal glasses caught the afternoon light and expensive cigars perfumed the air with imported tobacco, the future of organized crime in America was being negotiated by men whose names would never appear in the guest registry. Frank Costello stood at the window of his suite, watching the crowds below with the same analytical attention he brought to everything involving human behavior. At 38, he had traveled far from the tenement neighborhoods of East Harlem, his suits now cut by tailors who dressed senators, his manner polished by years of dining with politicians and judges who found his company more profitable than principled. The invitation to Atlantic City had come from Johnny Torrio, the former Chicago boss, whose near-death experience had convinced him that the current state of affairs, the constant warfare between rival organizations, the mounting body count that was drawing unwanted federal attention, required fundamental restructuring. The conference that would unfold over the next 3 days had been months in planning. Meyer Lansky had been instrumental in the logistics, coordinating travel arrangements and accommodations with the same meticulous attention to detail he brought to rum-running operations. His genius lay in understanding that men who might shoot each other in New York could be persuaded to sit down together in neutral territory, that the right setting and careful orchestration could create possibilities for negotiation that seemed impossible in the heat of territorial conflict. Vito Genovese had arrived the previous evening, his presence in Atlantic City creating ripples of tension among delegates who understood what he represented. At 32, he had become Joe Messeria's most trusted enforcer, the man called upon when the old boss needed problems eliminated with finality. His attendance at a conference explicitly designed to reduce violence carried a certain irony that wasn't lost on anyone who knew his reputation. But Messeria had sent him for precisely that reason, to remind everyone that peace could only be achieved if all parties understood the consequences of its failure. The opening session began after dinner, when stomachs were full and expensive liquor had smoothed the rough edges of old animosities. Torrio presided with the calm authority of a man who had survived by knowing when to fight and when to negotiate. Around the table sat the most powerful criminals in America, Al Capone from Chicago, his scarred face and volatile temperament barely contained by expensive tailoring. Lucky Luciano from New York, whose sharp intelligence and willingness to transcend ethnic boundaries had made him indispensable to the younger generation, and representatives from Philadelphia, Detroit, Kansas City, and a dozen other cities where Prohibition had created empires built on supplying America's thirst. Costello spoke early in the proceedings, his voice carrying the measured tones of someone accustomed to addressing men of power. The current situation, he explained, benefited no one. Bodies in the streets drew newspaper attention and public outcry, which in turn forced politicians to demand enforcement they would otherwise happily ignore. Federal agents who might be bought off or discouraged instead became zealous when public pressure demanded results. What was needed wasn't just a temporary truce, but a permanent structure, a system for resolving disputes without resorting to violence that threatened everyone's operations. The argument was pragmatic rather than moral, and that pragmatism resonated with men who had built their fortunes on understanding human nature's baser instincts. Torrio elaborated on Costello's theme, proposing a national organization that would establish territories, mediate conflicts, and create standards for cooperation rather than competition. The model he outlined drew from corporate structures that had proven successful in legitimate business, with regional bosses functioning like division presidents and a central commission serving as a board of directors. Lansky watched these proceedings with the quiet intensity that characterized his involvement in any negotiation. He had come to Atlantic City understanding that the conference represented a pivotal moment, a chance to institutionalize the cooperative arrangements that he, Costello, and Genovese had developed through years of pragmatic collaboration. The old ways, built on ethnic loyalty and personal relationships, were crumbling under the weight of an industry that had grown too large for such informal governance. What was being proposed here was nothing less than the modernization of organized crime, its transformation from scattered street gangs into something approaching a national corporation. Not everyone embraced this vision with equal enthusiasm. The older bosses, men who had built their power on old-world principles of honor and blood loyalty, listened with expressions that range from skeptical to hostile. Joe Messeria, who had sent Genovese as his representative while remaining in New York, had made his position clear before the conference began. Any arrangement that required him to share power or accept limitations on his authority would be unacceptable. He was the boss of bosses, a title he had claimed through violence and defended with the same, and no committee would dictate terms to him. Genovese found himself in an uncomfortable position during these discussions. His loyalty to Meyer was genuine, built on years of mutual benefit and the kind of personal relationship that the old Sicilian culture valued above all else. But he was also young enough to recognize the logic in what Torrio and Costello and Luciano were proposing. The war between Meyer and Salvatore Maranzano, which had been consuming New York's Italian underworld for months, was bleeding both families white. Soldiers were dying, territories were in chaos, and the profits that should have been enriching everyone were instead being spent on guns and funerals. During a break in the formal proceedings, Costello found Genovese on the hotel balcony, where the younger man stood smoking and staring out at the ocean with an expression that suggested considerable internal conflict. The conversation that followed was conducted in the careful language of men who understood that words spoken in private might later carry public consequences. Costello didn't advocate for betrayal, didn't explicitly suggest that Genovese should abandon Meyer. Instead, he simply posed questions about the future, about whether the old ways could survive in a world that was changing with such velocity. What would happen, Costello asked, when prohibition inevitably ended? The politicians who had imposed it were already facing mounting pressure for repeal, and smart men prepared for transitions rather than clinging to arrangements that had expiration dates. Bootlegging had made them all wealthy, but it was fundamentally dependent on a law that most Americans had come to regard as a failed experiment. When that law was repealed, as it surely would be, what would sustain their operations? Only diversification, only the kind of organizational structure that could adapt to changing circumstances. Genovese listened with the attention he gave to anything involving his future prospects. The logic was unassailable. Meyer represented the past, a tradition that commanded respect but offered no pathway forward. The organization being proposed at this conference, with its emphasis on cooperation and structured governance, represented adaptation to American realities. Yet loyalty wasn't something that could be calculated like a balance sheet. It was a matter of honor, and honor in their world was currency that once spent could never be recovered. The conference concluded with agreements that would reshape organized crime for decades to come. Territories were established, with each major city assigned to specific organizations that would govern without interference from others. A commission structure was outlined, though its exact composition and authority would require further negotiation. And most significantly, a principle was established that cooperation across ethnic lines wasn't just permissible, but essential for future success. Lansky emerged from Atlantic City with a sense of satisfaction that had little to do with ego and everything to do with his appreciation for elegant solutions to complex problems. The framework established here would allow operations to expand with far less violence and waste. Costello had gained something even more valuable, validation of his belief that in America, power came through institutions rather than individual strongmen. And Genovese returned to New York carrying knowledge that would eventually force him to make a choice. that would define the rest of his life. The months following the Atlantic City Conference revealed both the promise and limitations of what had been achieved. In cities where younger, more pragmatic men held power, the new arrangements took hold with surprising speed. Territorial disputes that might have escalated into warfare were resolved through negotiation. Cooperative ventures between organizations that had previously been rivals became commonplace, and the violence that had characterized the early Prohibition years began to decline as men discovered that peace was more profitable than war. But in New York, where Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano remained locked in their bitter conflict, the Atlantic City agreements seemed almost irrelevant. Both old bosses rejected any framework that required them to share power or accept external mediation. They were Sicilians of the old school, men for whom respect came through strength and compromise indicated weakness. The war between them intensified through the autumn of 1929, even as the stock market crashed and the nation descended into economic depression that would make their bootlegging profits seem even more obscene by comparison. Genovese watched this escalating conflict with growing frustration. He had seen in Atlantic City what cooperation could achieve, had understood that the future belonged to men who could transcend the limitations of old-world thinking. But he was bound by loyalty to Masseria, a debt that couldn't be dismissed simply because more profitable arrangements beckoned. The tension between obligation and ambition created pressures that would eventually require resolution, though the form that resolution would take remained unclear through the winter of 1929. Costello and Lansky maintained their careful distance from the Masseria-Maranzano war, understanding that involvement would compromise the relationships they had cultivated with both sides. Their operations continued to prosper through cooperation with various factions, proof that the principles established in Atlantic City could work even in New York's fractious environment. But they also understood that the conflict between the old bosses would eventually reach a crisis point, and when it did, the decisions made in its resolution would determine whether the vision outlined at Atlantic City would become reality or remain an unfulfilled dream. By the spring of 1930, the fault lines were becoming impossible to ignore. Masseria's inflexibility had cost him allies and territory. Maranzano's aristocratic pretensions and rigid organizational vision were alienating younger men who found his Roman fantasies less compelling than practical arrangements that maximized profit. And throughout the conflict, a younger generation was having quiet conversations in restaurants and social clubs, conversations about what might be possible if the old guard could be convinced to step aside. Those conversations increasingly included Genovese, whose position as Masseria's enforcer made him valuable to any coalition seeking change. Luciano, who had been present at Atlantic City and understood what Costello and Lansky were building, began carefully probing Genovese's thinking about the future. The approach was oblique, conducted through intermediaries and hypothetical discussions that provided deniability if loyalties hadn't yet shifted. But the message was clear. There would be room in the new order for men who understood that adaptation was survival and clinging to the past was a form of slow suicide. The irony wasn't lost on Genovese that his reputation for violence, built through years of service to Masseria's old world vision, was now becoming an asset in planning the old boss's downfall. The skills that had made him valuable as an enforcer would be equally valuable in the transformation that was coming. But first, he would have to make a choice that violated everything the Sicilian culture had taught him about loyalty and honor. He would have to become, by the standards of that culture, a traitor. As the winter of 1930 approached, with its cold winds presaging changes more fundamental than seasonal shifts, three men who had found each other through years of pragmatic cooperation were positioning themselves for a transformation that would reshape American organized crime. Costello had provided the political sophistication that made legitimacy possible. Lansky had contributed the organizational genius that made efficiency inevitable. And Genovese, still wrestling with the decision that would define his future, represented the muscle that would make change irreversible once the moment for action arrived. The Atlantic City Conference had planted seeds that would take months to germinate. But when they finally broke through the soil, watered by the blood of men who couldn't adapt to changing times, they would grow into something unprecedented, a criminal organization that functioned according to American principles of efficiency and cooperation, rather than Sicilian traditions of honor and vendetta. The old world was dying in New York streets. What would replace it was still taking shape in conversations held in restaurants and hotel rooms, in the calculations of men who understood that the future belonged to those willing to seize it, regardless of what traditions had to be sacrificed in the process. The spring of 1931 arrived with false promise, its warm breezes carrying the scent of change and blood through New York streets. On a mild April afternoon, while cherry blossoms bloomed in Central Park and ordinary citizens celebrated the season of renewal, Vito Genovese stood in the kitchen of Scarpato's restaurant in Coney Island, checking his pistol with the methodical care of a craftsman preparing his tools. Upstairs, Joe Masseria was losing at cards to Charlie Luciano, and neither the old boss nor his young protege yet understood that the game they were playing had stakes far higher than the money on the table. The decision to move against Masseria had been months in the making, a conspiracy assembled piece by piece through conversations conducted in restaurants and private homes, in the back seats of automobiles cruising through neutral neighborhoods, anywhere that walls wouldn't carry whispers to ears that might betray them. Luciano had been the primary architect, his position as Masseria's trusted lieutenant, providing cover for meetings and phone calls that would have seemed treasonous to anyone who understood their true purpose. But the conspiracy had required more than Luciano's vision. It required Costello's political connections to ensure that law enforcement would look the other way during the crucial hours. It required Lansky's logistical planning to coordinate timing and escape routes. And it required Genovese's willingness to pull the trigger on a man who had been his mentor and patron for over a decade. The weight of that betrayal sat differently on each man's conscience, or would have if conscience played much role in their calculations. For Luciano, the elimination of Masseria was a business necessity, no different from closing an unprofitable operation or terminating an incompetent employee. The old boss's stubbornness had prolonged a war that was bleeding them all. His inability to adapt to changing circumstances threatened everything they were trying to build. Sentiment was a luxury that men in their position couldn't afford. Costello had maintained his characteristic distance from the actual mechanics of violence, He would be nowhere near Coney Island when the shooting started. His alibis established with the same meticulous attention he brought to all aspects of his operations. Later, when investigators came asking questions, he would express shock and regret with such convincing sincerity that even detectives who suspected his involvement would find no thread to pull that might unravel the larger conspiracy. His genius lay in understanding the power exercised from shadows cast no incriminating light. Lansky's role had been purely logistical, which suited his temperament perfectly. He had studied Messeria's routines with the same analytical rigor he applied to rum-running routes, identifying patterns and vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The Nuova Villa Tamaro restaurant in Coney Island had been chosen because it was far enough from Messeria's usual territory to reduce the likelihood of loyal soldiers happening by, yet familiar enough that the old boss wouldn't suspect anything unusual about dining there. The timing had been calculated to coincide with the lunch hour rush, when noise from the restaurant would mask the sound of gunfire, at least long enough for the shooters to escape. But it was Genovese who carried the heaviest burden, or should have. Joe Messeria had plucked him from the streets, had recognized potential in a violent teenager and shaped it into something useful, had trusted him with responsibilities that brought wealth and respect. The Sicilian code that both men honored or claimed to honor demanded absolute loyalty to such a patron. Betrayal wasn't just wrong by these standards, it was unthinkable, a violation of principles that supposedly set them apart from common criminals who operated without honor or tradition. Yet Genovese had spent months convincing himself that what he was about to do wasn't betrayal, but evolution. Messeria's inflexibility had made him an obstacle to progress, his old world thinking a liability in a new world context. The organization they were building, the one outlined in Atlantic City and refined through countless subsequent discussions, required leaders who understood that survival demanded adaptation. By clinging to traditions that no longer served their purpose, Messeria had forfeited his right to leadership. The logic was clean, persuasive, and utterly beside the point of the central fact that Genovese was about to murder the man who had made him. The card game upstairs proceeded with the desultory pace of an afternoon between friends with nowhere more pressing to be. Messeria, at 60, still carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed his position unassailable. He had survived assassination attempts, emerged victorious from gang wars, built an empire through force of will and strategic violence. The spring sunshine streaming through the restaurant windows caught the gold rings on his thick fingers as he studied his cards, and if he noticed anything unusual in Luciano's demeanor that afternoon, he gave no sign of it. Luciano excused himself around 3:30, his departure so casual that Messeria barely looked up from his hand. The younger man walked to the restroom with measured steps, his footsteps echoing slightly on the restaurant's tile floor. Behind him, he left his mentor playing solitaire now, the other players having departed earlier according to plan. The restaurant owner, Gerardo Scarpato, busied himself in the kitchen with the desperate activity of a man who knows what's coming and wants no part in witnessing it. The killers entered through the kitchen entrance, their movements practiced and efficient. 4 men, though later accounts would vary on their identities. Some would claim it was Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel. Others would dispute these names, substituting different shooters in an attempt to protect certain reputations or settle old scores. The truth, like most truths about that day, would remain deliberately obscured by men who understood that uncertainty was a form of protection. The first shot shattered the afternoon quiet, its sharp crack followed immediately by others in rapid succession. Masseria tried to rise from his chair, his hand reaching instinctively for the gun he always carried, but age and surprise betrayed him. The bullets found their marks with professional precision, and Joe the Boss Masseria, who had proclaimed himself the strongest man in New York, slumped across the card table that bore the remnants of his final meal. The playing cards scattered around him would later become the subject of legend, with newspapers reporting that the ace of spades rested in his dead hand, a theatrical detail that captured public imagination, even if its accuracy remained questionable. Luciano emerged from the restroom several minutes after the shooting stopped, his expression arranged in carefully calibrated shock. The performance was unnecessary, since Scarpato was the only witness and he understood perfectly well that survival required a selective memory about what he had seen. Still, Luciano maintained the fiction, because maintaining fictions was what men in his position did instinctively, creating layers of deniability that might prove useful if authorities decided to pursue the case with unexpected vigor. The police investigation that followed was thorough in its procedures and deliberately limited in its conclusions. Detectives found one of the killer's coats left behind in their haste, traced it back to a small-time hood named Sam Palaccia, but could never quite assemble enough evidence to bring charges that would survive the judicial process. Witnesses remembered nothing useful. Physical evidence led nowhere productive, and within days, the case settled into the limbo of unsolved murders that New York's overwhelmed police department learned to accept as an inevitable cost of doing business with organized crime. Across town in Little Italy, the news of Masseria's death traveled through the neighborhood with the speed of electricity through copper wire. In social clubs and restaurants, in barber shops and coffee houses, men gathered to discuss what the murder meant for the delicate balance of power that had kept their world functioning. Some expressed genuine grief for a leader who, whatever his flaws, had commanded respect and provided structure. Others saw opportunity in the vacuum his death created, calculating how they might improve their positions in the reorganization that would inevitably follow. Salvatore Maranzano received the news in his estate in Long Island, where he had been waiting with the patience of a man who understood that rushing rarely improved outcomes. The death of his principal rival should have filled him with satisfaction, and perhaps it did. But those who knew him well noticed something else in his reaction, a cautiousness that suggested he understood that eliminating Masseria solved only the most obvious problem. The younger generation that had orchestrated the killing, men like Luciano and Genovese and their Jewish associates, had proven themselves capable of patricide. Such men might accept his leadership temporarily, but they would never truly submit to authority that limited their own ambitions. The meeting that followed Masseria's death brought together the surviving leaders of New York's Italian underworld in a gathering that would have been impossible just days earlier. Maranzano presided with the dignity he believed befitted his position, outlining his vision for a reorganized structure based on Roman military principles. There would be families, each with its own boss, underboss, and captains. There would be clear chains of command and mechanisms for resolving disputes without warfare. And there would be himself as capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, the ultimate authority to whom all others would answer. Luciano listened to this presentation with his characteristic inscrutability, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts about Maranzano's presumption. Genovese stood against the wall, his eyes tracking the reactions of other men in the room, noting who seemed enthusiastic about Maranzano's vision and who maintained careful neutrality. Costello and Lansky weren't present at this meeting, their involvement in Italian family business being diplomatically limited, but their influence hung over the proceedings like smoke that couldn't be dispersed by simply opening windows. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone with sufficient perspective to appreciate it. They had killed Masseria to escape the tyranny of an inflexible boss who refused to share power, only to watch Maranzano immediately claim the very title and authority they had worked to eliminate. The Roman organizational structure he proposed was more sophisticated than Masseria's crude rule through violence and intimidation. But sophistication didn't change the fundamental mathematics of the arrangement. One man would sit at the apex of power, and all others would be subordinate to his will. Through the summer of 1931, Maranzano consolidated his position with moves that combined political skill and strategic violence. Men who had supported Masseria were given opportunities to pledge loyalty to the new regime or face consequences that needed no elaboration. The organizational structure he had outlined at the first meeting took concrete shape, with families established and territories assigned according to principles that seemed rational if you accepted the premise that Maranzano's authority was legitimate and enduring. But beneath the surface of this apparent order, other conversations were taking place. Luciano had begun quietly gauging support for an alternative arrangement, one that would eliminate the position of boss of bosses entirely in favor of a commission structure where power would be shared rather than concentrated. The model was similar to what had been discussed in Atlantic City, though refined through experience and adapted to address specific concerns that had emerged since then. Costello's political connections had revealed something troubling to anyone concerned about Maranzano's long-term viability. The new boss of bosses had been attracting unwanted attention from federal authorities who saw in his ostentatious success an opportunity to demonstrate government capability against organized crime. Tax investigations were being initiated, informants cultivated, surveillance established. The shadow of what would eventually happen to Al Capone, brought down not by rival gangsters, but by Internal Revenue Service accountants, was beginning to fall across Maranzano's operation. Lansky had been conducting his own analysis of the situation with characteristic thoroughness. His conclusion was stark in its simplicity. Maranzano's position was untenable, not because he lacked intelligence or capability, but because the structure he had created concentrated too much power in one man. Such concentration created a single point of failure that enemies could target. More fundamentally, it violated the American principle that had made their Atlantic City agreements workable, that cooperation among equals was more stable than subordination to authority. Genovese found himself in a familiar position that summer, once again weighing loyalty against ambition, tradition against pragmatism. He had thrown his lot in with Maranzano after betraying Masseria, believing that the new boss represented a more sophisticated and sustainable approach to leadership. But Maranzano's increasing paranoia and heavy-handed management style were revealing themselves as merely more polished versions of the same authoritarian impulse that had made Masseria obsolete. The decision to move against Maranzano coalesced through August with an inevitability that felt almost mechanical. Same men who had orchestrated Masseria's death 6 months earlier began planning a sequel, this time with even greater urgency, since Maranzano had started compiling lists of men he viewed as threats to his authority. Luciano's name was reportedly near the top of those lists, along with Genovese, Costello, and various others who had proven themselves too ambitious or independent for subordinate roles in Maranzano's Roman hierarchy. The method chosen for Maranzano's elimination carried the kind of ironic elegance that Costello particularly appreciated. Word would be sent that IRS agents were coming to Maranzano's office at 230 Park Avenue to discuss tax irregularities. The old Sicilian, already nervous about federal attention, would believe the cover story because it aligned with his existing fears. And when the supposed agents arrived, they would be killers employed by men who understood that sometimes the best disguise was the threat your target was already expecting. September 10th, 1931, dawned clear and warm, the kind of late summer day that made New York's steel and concrete canyons feel almost welcoming. Maranzano arrived at his office that morning with his usual retinue, conducted business with his usual efficiency, and had no reason to suspect that the day would be his last. When his secretary announced that men from the Internal Revenue Service had arrived for an appointment, his face registered resignation rather than surprise. The tax investigation he had been dreading was finally materializing, and there was nothing to do but face it with whatever dignity he could muster. The 4 men who entered his office carried themselves with the bureaucratic authority of government employees, their suits conservative, their manner professionally distant. They were led by a man who identified himself as an IRS investigator, his credentials convincing enough to pass Maranzano's scrutiny in the brief moment before everything collapsed into violence. The knives came out first, quiet and efficient, though Maranzano's struggles made complete silence impossible. Shots followed, their sound muffled, but not eliminated by the office's thick walls, and Salvatore Maranzano, who had styled himself after Julius Caesar and created an organizational structure based on Roman legions, died as Caesar had died, betrayed by men he had believed he could control. The aftermath of Maranzano's death unfolded with greater complexity than Masseria's elimination had required. This time, there could be no pretense of rival gangs or unknown assailants. Maranzano had been killed in his own office during business hours, in a manner that suggested both careful planning and inside information. The investigation would be more thorough, the political pressure more intense, the need for convincing explanations more urgent. But the men who had ordered Maranzano's death had prepared for these complications with the same attention to detail they brought to all their operations. Costello's political connections ensured that investigators understood the boundaries of what could be pursued and what needed to remain officially mysterious. Lansky's careful management of witnesses and evidence created confusion where clarity might have proven dangerous, and Genovese's reputation for violence served as deterrent to anyone who might have considered cooperating with authorities in exchange for protection that everyone understood would prove inadequate against his particular brand of retribution. Within weeks of Maranzano's death, the organizational structure that would govern organized crime in America for decades began to take its final form. The title of Boss of Bosses was formally abolished, relegated to history, along with the men who had claimed it. In its place emerged the Commission, a council of equals representing the 5 families in New York and various other organizations across the country. Luciano would serve as chairman, but his authority would be limited by the need to build consensus rather than issue commands. The triumvirate that had been taking shape since Atlantic City now stood revealed as the real power behind this new structure. Costello's political sophistication had made it possible to operate with relative immunity from law enforcement. Lansky's organizational genius had created the systems and procedures that allowed coordinated action across geographical and ethnic boundaries, and Genovese's reputation for violence, now amplified by his participation in 2 boss killings within 6 months, provided the enforcement mechanism that ensured decisions once made would be implemented without excessive argument. They had killed 2 kings to ensure that no more crowns would be worn in their world. The old Sicilian traditions of absolute loyalty and unquestioned authority had been replaced by thoroughly American principles of shared power and institutional governance. It was, in its way, a revolution as significant as any political transformation occurring in the legitimate world, though its architects would never appear in history books or receive recognition for their contribution to organizational theory. As autumn settled over New York and the summer's violence faded into the kind of legend that would be embellished with each retelling, 3 men who had emerged from poverty and discrimination to reshape American organized crime looked toward a future that seemed, for the moment, manageable and profitable. They had proven themselves capable of killing the very men who had made them, had demonstrated that pragmatism could overcome loyalty when circumstances demanded it. Whether they had created something stable or merely postponed, inevitable conflicts remained to be seen. But for now, in the autumn of 1931, the empire they had imagined during those early Prohibition years was finally real, built on the corpses of men who had failed to understand that in America, even criminals were ultimately subject to market forces that rewarded adaptation and punished inflexibility. The autumn of 1932 found the 3 men consolidating power in a transformed world where the rules they had helped establish now governed the largest criminal enterprise in American history. In a penthouse suite overlooking Central Park, where the leaves were turning colors that matched the gold and blood that had built their empire, Frank Costello adjusted his silk tie in the mirror and prepared for a meeting with a congressman whose campaign he had quietly funded. Across town, Meyer Lansky reviewed ledgers that tracked profits from operations spanning from New York to Havana, his pale eyes noting discrepancies that would require attention. And in Little Italy, Vito Genovese received tribute from soldiers who understood that respect was earned through fear, even if that fear was wrapped in velvet courtesy. Costello's transformation from street criminal to what newspapers would eventually call the Prime Minister of the underworld had been the most visible of the three men's evolutions. His apartment in the majestic on Central Park West spoke of taste, refined by money and education acquired through careful observation of his social betters. The politicians and judges who visited him there, ostensibly for friendly card games and discussion of city affairs, found him more sophisticated than many legitimate businessmen they dealt with, his insights into municipal governance often sharper than those offered by their official advisers. The political machine Costello had constructed operated with the elegance of Swiss clockwork. Police captains received monthly envelopes that ensured their enthusiastic cooperation with various enterprises requiring official blindness. Judges found themselves indebted through campaign contributions that arrived precisely when needed, creating relationships that could be called upon when legal complications threatened business operations. Tammany Hall politicians discovered that Costello's support could make or break careers. His ability to deliver votes in Italian and Jewish neighborhoods, making him indispensable during elections that were often decided by narrow margins. Yet Costello's genius lay not in the corruption itself, which was hardly unusual in New York politics, but in the restraint he exercised in calling in favors. He understood that power unused retained its potency, that judges who owed him were more valuable if they believed their debts remained unpaid when he did require intervention, whether to dismiss charges against an associate or to ensure favorable outcomes in commercial disputes masquerading as legitimate business disagreements. His requests were phrased with such delicacy that recipients could almost convince themselves they were acting from friendship rather than obligation. Meyer Lansky's empire was built on different foundations, but operated according to the same principles of efficiency and long-term planning. The repeal of prohibition in 1933 had been anticipated years earlier, and Lansky had prepared accordingly. While others scrambled to replace bootlegging revenue with hastily conceived schemes, Lansky had already established the Malaska Corporation, a slot machine operation that placed gambling devices in thousands of locations across the country. The profits were substantial and, more importantly, generated with far less violence than bootlegging had required. His vision extended beyond American borders. In Cuba, where dictator Fulgencio Batista was consolidating power through methods that organized crime figures found refreshingly familiar, Lansky had negotiated arrangements that would transform Havana into a gambling paradise. The Hotel Nacional would become the crown jewel of these operations, its casino attracting wealthy Americans who wanted proximity to U.S. soil without the legal restrictions that still limited gambling in most American states. Batista received payments that dwarfed what legitimate businesses contributed to government coffers, and in return provided the kind of protection that only dictatorial power could guarantee. The beauty of Lansky's Cuban operations lay in their apparent legitimacy. The casinos were licensed, taxes were paid on declared revenues, and the tourist infrastructure they supported provided real economic benefits to a nation struggling with poverty and political instability. That the actual profits flowing to Lansky and his associates vastly exceeded reported figures was a detail that required cooperation from accountants rather than soldiers. Numbers, properly managed, could conceal more than any amount of violence could intimidate witnesses into forgetting. Genovese's role in their triumvirate remained what it had always been, though the scale and sophistication of his operations had evolved considerably since the early days of Prohibition. Labor racketeering had become his primary focus, with unions in the garment district, waterfront, and construction trades providing steady income through arrangements that combined genuine worker advocacy with selective violence against employers who resisted cooperation. The International Longshoremen's Association, in particular, became a Genovese stronghold, its control over New York's docks giving him influence over everything that moved through the world's busiest port. His reputation for violence, amplified by his participation in eliminating both Masseria and Maranzano, served primarily as deterrent rather than active threat. Most disputes could be resolved through reputation alone, with mere mention of Genovese's potential involvement, encouraging reasonable settlement terms. When actual violence proved necessary, it was applied with surgical precision rather than the messy enthusiasm that characterized less professional operations. Bodies that needed to disappear did so completely. Messages that required sending were delivered with unmistakable clarity. Yet something was beginning to fester beneath the surface of Genovese's apparent success, a resentment that those closest to him could sense, even if they couldn't articulate its source. He had killed two bosses and helped establish a system where power was shared rather than concentrated. But in that sharing, he remained fundamentally the muscle, while Costello and Lansky operated at levels that seemed more legitimate, more respectable. His wealth equaled theirs. His influence was substantial, but the nature of his contribution remained rooted in violence, while theirs had transcended such crude methods. The dynamic between the three men during these golden years resembled a three-legged stool, each component essential to supporting the structure, but fundamentally different in character. Costello's political connections provided insulation from law enforcement that made their continued operations possible. Lansky's organizational genius created systems that maximized profits while minimizing exposure to criminal prosecution, and Genovese's enforcement capability ensured that agreements once made were honored, that territories remained respected, that the threat of consequences discouraged defection or betrayal. Their operations intersected but remained largely independent, a deliberate strategy that protected each from the other's potential legal troubles. When Luciano was convicted on forced prostitution charges in 1936 and sentenced to 30 to 50 years, his conviction sent shockwaves through their world but didn't collapse their structure precisely because power had been distributed rather than concentrated. Costello assumed leadership of what had been Luciano's family. Lansky continued expanding his gambling empire, and Genovese managed labor operations that required no formal acknowledgement of organizational hierarchy. Luciano's conviction and eventual deportation created opportunities that each man exploited according to his particular talents. Costello's ascension to family leadership made his political connections even more valuable, since he now controlled the soldiers and captains who could provide the muscle necessary to enforce favorable outcomes. Lansky used Luciano's absence to expand operations that might have faced resistance from the more tradition-bound Sicilian, particularly the increasing cooperation with Jewish gangsters that was transforming organized crime into a genuinely multi-ethnic enterprise. And Genovese, while publicly expressing loyalty to his imprisoned friend, quietly consolidated control over operations that Luciano's departure had left vulnerable. The families they had built bore little resemblance to the chaotic street gangs of their youth. Hierarchies were clearly defined, with bosses, underbosses, consiglieri, and captains each possessing specific responsibilities and authorities. Soldiers understood their place in the organization, their obligations to superiors, and the rewards that came with faithful service. The commission met regularly to address disputes and coordinate activities that crossed family boundaries, its decisions carrying weight that derived from collective enforcement capability rather than any single strongman's authority. Money flowed through these organizations with the volume and complexity of major corporations. Lansky's accounting systems tracked revenues from gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and various legitimate businesses that served as fronts or had been acquired through profits from illegal enterprises. The numbers were staggering, particularly during years when the Great Depression had devastated legitimate business and left millions unemployed. While ordinary Americans struggled to feed their families, organized crime enjoyed prosperity that seemed almost obscene by comparison. This prosperity funded lifestyles that increasingly diverged between the three men. Costello embraced high society with enthusiasm that suggested genuine enjoyment rather than mere social climbing. His wife, Loretta, moved comfortably in circles that included legitimate businessmen and their families, her manners so refined that few would have guessed her husband's true occupation. Their apartment hosted dinner parties, where conversation ranged across politics, arts, and business with sophisticated ease that would have been impossible for the teenage immigrant who had arrived from Calabria decades earlier. Lansky's domestic life remained deliberately modest despite his enormous wealth. He lived comfortably but not ostentatiously, understanding that excessive displays attracted attention from tax authorities and journalists who might ask uncomfortable questions about income sources. His second wife, Anna, whom he married after his first marriage ended, shared his preference for privacy. Their home was tastefully appointed, but could have belonged to any successful businessman, which was precisely the impression Lansky cultivated. Genovese's personal life was considerably more turbulent. His first marriage had ended. His second wife, Anna, had died under circumstances that fed rumors about his involvement. And his third marriage, to a woman whose husband had conveniently died shortly before their wedding, suggested either extraordinary coincidence or something considerably darker. Those who knew him understood that Genovese's capacity for violence extended beyond professional requirements into personal matters, that the same ruthlessness he brought to business disputes could be applied to domestic complications. The differences in their personal lives reflected deeper divergences in how they understood their roles and futures. Costello had always aspired to legitimacy, seeing criminal enterprise as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. His political connections and legitimate business investments were preparing for eventual transition into entirely legal operations, though that transition would take decades and would never completely sever connections to criminal activity. Lansky similarly viewed their enterprises through a long-term lens, understanding that smart money diversified and that entirely legal businesses provided both profit and protection. But Genovese seemed trapped by his reputation and role in ways that frustrated him even as they enriched him. He was too valuable as an enforcer, too effective at violence to be easily repositioned into less controversial operations. His attempts to develop legitimate business interests never quite succeeded, perhaps because the taint of his reputation made even corrupt businessmen nervous about association, or perhaps because his temperament was fundamentally unsuited to the patient negotiation that legitimate enterprise required. By 1940, as war engulfed Europe and America debated its eventual involvement, the three men who had reshaped organized crime into something unprecedented found themselves approaching middle age with empires that seemed secure, but foundations that were beginning to show subtle cracks. Costello was 50, his transformation into political power broker nearly complete. Lansky was 38, his gambling operations expanding with each passing year into new territories and new forms. And Genovese was 43, wealthy and feared, but increasingly resentful of a role that felt limiting even as it provided enormous profits. The empire they had built together rested on complementary strengths that had proven remarkably durable through a decade of operations. But empires, particularly those built on blood and maintained through violence, rarely survive transitions that test the loyalty binding their architects together. The coming war would provide such a test, though none of them could yet see how profoundly it would reshape not just their world, but their relationships with each other. For now, in 1940, they remained partners in the largest criminal enterprise in American history. Three men whose different paths from immigrant poverty had converged to create something that would outlast them all, even as the partnership that had built it was beginning its slow dissolution into rivalry and betrayal. The war changed everything, though not in ways any of them anticipated. On a December morning in 1941, as news of Pearl Harbor crackled through radios across New York and ordinary Americans gathered in stunned silence, Meyer Lansky sat in his modest office on the Lower East Side and understood that the conflict had just provided him an opportunity that no amount of criminal genius could have manufactured. The chance to serve his adopted country while simultaneously expanding his influence beyond anything Prohibition had made possible. 2 blocks away, Frank Costello was already fielding telephone calls from naval intelligence officers who needed help securing New York's waterfront against sabotage. And across the Atlantic, Vito Genovese was making calculations of an entirely different nature. Genovese had fled to Italy in 1937, driven not by patriotism or nostalgia, but by the pedestrian reality of a murder indictment that threatened to interrupt his career with an extended prison sentence. Ferdinand Boccia, a small-time hood who had made the mistake of cheating Genovese in a card game, had been found dead under circumstances that pointed unmistakably toward Genovese's involvement. Rather than trust the legal system his money had so often corrupted, Genovese had chosen exile, settling in Naples, where his wealth and reputation preceded him like letters of introduction to Italian criminal society. His timing, viewed through the lens of history, was either remarkably fortunate or catastrophically poor, depending on which outcomes one chose to emphasize. Italy under Mussolini offered opportunities for a man of Genovese's particular talents, and the Sicilian had quickly ingratiated himself with fascist officials who appreciated his organizational skills and were not overly concerned with the morality of his methods. By 1941, Genovese had become a significant figure in Italy's black market operations, his connections to American organized crime making him valuable to a regime that needed dollars and goods that official channels couldn't provide. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Genovese found himself in the peculiar position of being an American citizen collaborating with the enemy government. Though collaboration might be too strong a word for relationships that were fundamentally commercial rather than ideological, he had no particular loyalty to fascism beyond its utility in protecting his operations. His contributions to the Italian war effort were motivated by profit rather than patriotism, a distinction that would later prove crucial when Allied forces occupied Italy and began sorting collaborators from simple criminals. Back in New York, the war was creating opportunities that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. Commander Charles Haffenden of Naval Intelligence had a problem that conventional military resources couldn't address. German submarines were operating with suspicious efficiency along the Atlantic coast, suggesting intelligence gathering that might be aided by Nazi sympathizers working on New York's docks. The waterfront was controlled by unions that answered to men like Costello and Lansky, and official channels for securing cooperation had proven frustratingly ineffective. The approach to Costello came through intermediaries carefully chosen to make the proposal seem reasonable rather than desperate. The Navy needed information about suspicious activity on the docks, needed assurance that longshoremen would report sabotage attempts, needed the kind of cooperation that couldn't be commanded but might be negotiated with men who controlled the relevant unions. In exchange, the government was prepared to offer something valuable: legitimacy, at least temporarily, and the gratitude of a nation at war. Costello understood immediately that the opportunity extended beyond simple patriotism, though his willingness to help shouldn't be dismissed as purely mercenary. He had arrived in America as a child, had built his entire life on American soil, and felt genuine loyalty to a country that had allowed immigrants like himself to prosper beyond anything possible in the old world. But he also recognized that cooperation with naval intelligence would provide political capital that could be invested long after the war ended, that judges and politicians would remember who had helped protect American ships when the nation's survival seemed uncertain. The operation that emerged from these negotiations would eventually be called Operation Underworld, though that name wouldn't be applied until years later, when historians attempted to understand the peculiar partnership between organized crime and military intelligence. Costello's role was primarily coordination, connecting naval intelligence with the men who actually controlled dock operations. But it was Lansky who proved most valuable in the intricate work of gathering intelligence and ensuring waterfront security. Lansky had always possessed a gift for seeing patterns in apparently disconnected information, and this talent transferred seamlessly to intelligence work. His network of contacts among longshoremen, truck drivers, and small business owners along the waterfront began feeding information to naval intelligence with a reliability that astonished officers accustomed to the bureaucratic incompetence of official channels. Suspicious individuals were identified and tracked. Potential sabotage operations were disrupted before they could threaten ships or cargo. And all of it happened with an efficiency that made clear how thoroughly organized crime had penetrated legitimate commerce. The cooperation extended beyond simple intelligence gathering. When the Navy proposed using Lucky Luciano, still imprisoned at Great Meadow Correctional Facility, to facilitate mafia cooperation with the Allied invasion of Sicily, Costello and Lansky were instrumental in arranging meetings and translating Luciano's suggestions into actionable intelligence. The exiled boss's knowledge of Sicilian geography and criminal networks proved invaluable in planning operations that would have been far more costly without local cooperation. Luciano's transfer from Great Meadow to Sing Sing, ostensibly to make visits easier, but actually to facilitate his secret meetings with naval intelligence, was arranged through channels that involved both Costello's political connections and official government authorization. The irony of America's most famous gangster helping to plan military operations wasn't lost on anyone involved, but war created pragmatic arrangements that peacetime morality would never have permitted. Through 1943 and 1944, as Allied forces fought their way up the Italian peninsula and the outcome of the war shifted decisively toward eventual victory, the relationship between organized crime and military intelligence deepened in ways that would have lasting implications. Officers who might have spent their peacetime careers prosecuting men like Costello and Lansky instead found themselves depending on their cooperation. Politicians who had campaigned on law and order platforms discovered that winning the war required compromises with criminals whose contributions, however distasteful, were undeniably effective. Genovese watched these developments from Italy with growing unease. He had spent the war years building relationships with fascist officials who were now being arrested or executed as Allied forces established control. His black market operations, so profitable during the chaos of war, were being disrupted by military authorities who took a dim view of profiteering regardless of which side had benefited. And most troubling, his former associates in New York were earning rehabilitation through patriotic service, while he remained tainted by collaboration with the enemy. The transformation came with remarkable speed once Genovese understood the trajectory of events. By the time American forces occupied Naples in 1944, he had repositioned himself as a valuable asset to the Allied military government. His knowledge of local criminal networks and black market operations, making him useful to officers trying to establish order in a devastated city. His work as an interpreter and liaison earned him a position of trust with American authorities who either didn't know or chose to ignore his collaboration with the fascist regime. The murder charges that had driven Genovese into exile 4 years earlier remained on the books in New York, but circumstances had changed in ways that made prosecution increasingly unlikely. The primary witness against him had died in 1941 under circumstances that suggested accident rather than murder, and other witnesses had either disappeared or developed convenient memory problems. When Genovese finally arranged his return to America in 1945, the charges were quietly dropped for lack of evidence, a development that owed more to Costello's political connections than to any deficiency in the original case. His homecoming was not the triumphant return of a war hero. Those who knew the details of his Italian activities understood that his service to the Allied military government had been opportunistic rather than ideologically motivated, that his abandonment of fascist connections had occurred only when their utility ended. But the specifics were sufficiently murky that outright condemnation was difficult, and in the immediate post-war period, attention was focused on reconstruction rather than settling scores from a conflict that everyone wanted to forget. The relationship between Genovese, Costello, and Lansky had fundamentally altered during the war years in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent until later. Costello had emerged from the conflict with enhanced political stature, his cooperation with naval intelligence earning him relationships that extended into military and intelligence circles. Lansky's reputation as a patriot who had helped protect American ships gave him a legitimacy that decades of criminal activity had never provided. Both men had demonstrated that organized crime could serve national interests when circumstances aligned properly. Genovese returned to find his former partners elevated in ways that made his own status diminished by comparison. He had spent the war years in exile, accumulating wealth through black market operations, but missing the opportunity to rehabilitate his reputation through service. His relationship with the Allied military government had been useful for avoiding prosecution, but carried none of the patriotic cachet that Costello and Lansky's cooperation with naval intelligence had generated. The resentment that had been quietly festering through the 1930s now had additional fuel. Genovese had always been the muscle in their triumvirate, providing enforcement capability while Costello handled politics and Lansky managed finances. But the war had revealed that he was also the most replaceable, that his particular talents were less essential to their continued success than the sophisticated operations his partners controlled. Violence could be outsourced to any number of capable soldiers. Political connections and organizational genius were considerably harder to replicate. As 1946 dawned and America adjusted to peacetime, after 4 years of global conflict, the three men who had built the most powerful criminal organization in the nation's history found themselves operating in a fundamentally altered landscape. The commission structure they had helped establish continued to govern organized crime with reasonable efficiency. The families remained profitable and relatively peaceful, but the bonds that had held Genovese, Costello, and Lansky together through nearly 2 decades of partnership were beginning to show strain that no amount of shared history could permanently repair. Luciano's deportation to Italy in 1946, the price extracted for his cooperation with naval intelligence, removed another stabilizing influence from their world. The exiled boss had served as mediator in disputes between the three men, his authority deriving from having founded the modern structure of organized crime in America. Without his presence, even from prison, the careful balance that had prevented their different ambitions from colliding was beginning to fail. The war had proven that Costello and Lansky could operate at levels that transcended simple criminality, that their talents had value to legitimate institutions when circumstances demanded unconventional solutions. Genovese had proven only that he was adaptable enough to survive changing political circumstances, a valuable trait, but not one that elevated him to the status his partners had achieved. The distinction seemed subtle, perhaps even meaningless, to outsiders who saw them all as criminals, regardless of patriotic service. But within their world, where respect and reputation determined position as surely as formal titles did in legitimate organizations, the distinction was profound and potentially catastrophic. The partnership that had reshaped American organized crime was entering its final phase, though none of them yet recognized how completely the war had altered the mathematics of their relationship. For now, in 1946, they remained nominally allied, their operations continuing to generate enormous profits, their positions seemingly secure. But the foundation had cracked in ways that would prove irreparable, and the conflicts those cracks would eventually produce would determine which of their visions for the future of organized crime would prevail when the inevitable reckoning finally arrived. The decade that followed would test whether their alliance could survive peace, and the answer arrived on a spring evening in 1957, with the sound of gunfire echoing through the marble lobby of the majestic apartments on Central Park West. Frank Costello was returning from dinner, his mind occupied with the political arrangements that had consumed his day, when Vincent, the Chin Gigante, stepped from the shadows with a revolver and a mandate from Vito Genovese that their partnership was officially dissolved. The bullet that grazed Costello's scalp that night was meant to kill, but it accomplished something perhaps more significant. It announced to anyone paying attention that the triumvirate that had governed New York's underworld for a quarter century was finished. The years between 1946 and that May evening had been marked by escalating tensions that those closest to the three men could sense even when open conflict remained carefully avoided. Genovese had returned from Italy with ambitions that exceeded the role of enforcer he had occupied before the war, his time abroad having convinced him that he possessed leadership qualities that deserved recognition beyond merely executing orders. Costello's ascension to leadership of what had been Luciano's family, combined with his enhanced political status following Operation Underworld, had made him the most visible and arguably most powerful figure in organized crime. And Lansky had continued his expansion into gambling operations that stretched from Las Vegas to Havana, his wealth and influence growing with each passing year. The first serious fracture appeared in 1951 with the Kefauver Committee hearings, a Senate investigation into organized crime that brought unprecedented public attention to activities that had previously operated in comfortable obscurity. Costello's appearance before the committee, televised to millions of Americans who watched with fascinated horror as criminals discussed their operations with congressional representatives, was intended to demonstrate government capability against organized crime. Instead, it transformed Costello into a peculiar kind of celebrity, the sophisticated gangster whose courteous manner and expensive suits suggested that criminals could operate at levels of refinement that challenged public assumptions about vice and moral degradation. Genovese watched these hearings with emotions that mixed contempt for the exposure with envy of the attention. Costello's national prominence, even achieved through congressional investigation, represented a kind of legitimacy that violence could never purchase. The Prime Minister of the underworld, as newspapers had taken to calling him, moved in circles that would never welcome someone with Genovese's reputation for brutality. The distinction fed resentments that had been accumulating since the war years, when Costello and Lansky had earned rehabilitation through patriotic service while Genovese had been in exile. Through the early 1950s, Genovese began systematically eliminating rivals and consolidating power in ways that suggested preparation for a challenge to the existing order. Willie Moretti, Costello's longtime associate, and a man whose mental deterioration had made him a security liability, was killed in 1951 at a restaurant in New Jersey. The official story presented the murder as a mercy killing, putting down a friend before his increasingly erratic behavior endangered everyone around him. But those who understood the subtleties recognized it as a message about Genovese's willingness to eliminate even popular figures if circumstances demanded it. Albert Anastasia's murder in October 1957, shot to death while receiving a shave in the barbershop of the Park Sheraton Hotel, removed another obstacle to Genovese's ambitions. Anastasia had been one of the most feared killers in organized crime, his reputation for violence rivaling Genovese's own. But he had also been closely allied with Costello, and his elimination weakened the Prime Minister's position considerably. The barbers who witnessed the shooting claimed to have seen nothing useful. Their selective amnesia, a reminder that in some neighborhoods, blindness was a survival skill rather than a disability. Costello understood that these killings were preliminary moves in a larger campaign aimed ultimately at him. The attempt on his life in May 1957 confirmed what careful observation had already suggested. Genovese was no longer content with the collaborative arrangement that had governed their operations for decades. He wanted control, absolute authority of the kind that Masseria and Maranzano had claimed before being eliminated by the very system Genovese now sought to dismantle. The shooting at the Majestic Apartments failed in its immediate objective, but succeeded in delivering its essential message. Gigante's bullet had been meant to kill, but Costello's instinctive movement at the crucial moment had turned a fatal shot into a grazing wound that required stitches rather than a funeral. The doorman who had witnessed the shooting provided descriptions so vague as to be useless, and Costello himself, adhering to the code that forbade cooperation with police regardless of provocation, declined to identify his attacker with specificity that might support prosecution. But the message had been received with perfect clarity. Costello announced his retirement from active leadership shortly after recovering from his wound, understanding that continuing to challenge Genovese would likely result in more competent attempts on his life. At 66, he had accumulated enough wealth to live comfortably for whatever years remained, and his political connections would continue to provide influence without requiring the daily management of criminal operations that had become increasingly burdensome as he aged. His retreat from power left a vacuum that Genovese moved quickly to fill, taking control of the family that had been Luciano's, then Costello's, and installing loyalists in key positions throughout its hierarchy. By autumn of 1957, Genovese had positioned himself as arguably the most powerful boss in New York, his influence extending across operations that generated millions annually through labor racketeering, gambling, loan sharking, and various other enterprises that had replaced bootlegging as primary revenue sources. But power concentrated invites challenge, and Genovese's rapid accumulation of authority had created anxiety among other bosses who remembered what happened to Masseria and Maranzano when they attempted similar consolidation. The commission structure that had been established in 1931 was designed specifically to prevent any single boss from accumulating dangerous levels of power, and Genovese's ascension violated the spirit, if not the letter, of those arrangements. The summit at Apalachin was intended to legitimize Genovese's position, to demonstrate that other bosses accepted his authority and were willing to conduct business under his coordination. Joseph Barbara's estate in upstate New York provided the venue, chosen for its isolation and Barbara's reputation as a neutral figure whose hospitality could be trusted. On November 14, 1957, nearly 60 of the most powerful figures in organized crime gathered in this rural setting to discuss business that couldn't be conducted in cities where surveillance and investigation had become increasingly sophisticated. Lansky's absence from the summit was conspicuous to anyone who understood his significance within organized crime. He had been invited, of course, his position as one of the architects of modern criminal organization, making his presence expected. But Lansky had declined, pleading other commitments while actually calculating that Genovese's gathering carried risks that prudent men would avoid. His intelligence network had picked up indications of law enforcement interest in the meeting, though whether that interest would translate into actual interdiction remained uncertain. The police raid that disrupted the Appalachian summit was either a remarkable coincidence or the result of information provided by sources who wanted Genovese's legitimization effort to fail spectacularly. New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Croswell had been monitoring Barbara's property as part of routine investigation into local criminal activity, and the sudden influx of expensive automobiles and well-dressed men had attracted his attention. The roadblock he established caught most of the attendees either trying to leave or, in some cases, that would have been comical if the implications weren't so serious, fleeing through the woods surrounding Barbara's estate. The image of aging gangsters in expensive suits running through the forest, abandoning their vehicles and desperately trying to avoid arrest, was humiliating in ways that violence could never achieve. These were men who had built reputations on sophistication and control, who prided themselves on operating above the crude street-level criminality of their youth. Captured on country roads or emerging from the woods with their clothing torn and their dignity shredded, they became objects of public mockery that newspaper cartoonists exploited with gleeful enthusiasm. More significantly, the raid exposed the national scope of organized crime in ways that could no longer be dismissed as exaggeration by journalists or reformers. The attendees came from cities across the country, their presence at a rural New York estate demonstrating connections and coordination that contradicted official claims about the limited nature of criminal organization. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who had previously denied the existence of a national crime syndicate, found himself forced to acknowledge what law enforcement had been either ignoring or concealing for decades. Genovese's attempt to consolidate and legitimize his position had instead achieved the opposite, drawing unprecedented attention to organized crime structure and operations while simultaneously demonstrating his inability to organize even a simple meeting without catastrophic failure. The bosses who had attended at his invitation now faced legal scrutiny that would occupy them for years, their names and associations documented in ways that made future cooperation considerably more complicated. Costello, safe in his Manhattan apartment and officially retired from active management, must have appreciated the irony. The shooting that was meant to eliminate him had instead pushed him into a retirement that protected him from the fiasco at Appalachian and its consequences. Lansky, whose absence from the summit demonstrated the intelligence gathering that had always been his strength, continued his operations largely unmolested by the investigations that consumed others. But the true conspiracy was only beginning to reveal itself through the months following Appalachian. Genovese's conviction on narcotics charges in 1959, based on testimony from informant Nelson Cantellops, an investigation that seemed remarkably well-informed about operations that should have been insulated from outside knowledge, carried the distinctive marks of a frame-up orchestrated by men who understood how the system worked. The evidence was sufficient for conviction, but suspiciously neat. The witnesses unusually cooperative, the timing perfect for removing Genovese from power, just as he seemed positioned to dominate organized crime. Those familiar with Costello and Lansky's methods recognized their fingerprints on the operation, though proving their involvement would have been impossible, even if authorities had been inclined to investigate. The narcotics case that sent Genovese to prison for 15 years was ostensibly about drug trafficking, but the real crime being punished was attempting to concentrate power in ways that violated the commission structure. The sentence was life imprisonment in effect, since Genovese was 62 at conviction and unlikely to survive long enough to see freedom again. The decade that had begun with an assassination attempt at the Majestic Apartments ended with one partner retired, another imprisoned, and the third continuing operations with the calm efficiency that had always characterized his approach to business. The triumvirate that had built modern organized crime in America had dissolved completely, destroyed not by external pressure, but by internal ambitions that proved incompatible with sustained cooperation. Genovese spent his remaining years in federal prison at Leavenworth, then Atlanta, continuing to issue orders and maintain influence over the family that bore his name. But imprisonment was not leadership, and the control he exercised from behind bars diminished with each passing year as circumstances changed and new generations rose to prominence. His death from a heart attack in 1969 would pass with surprisingly little ceremony, a reminder that even the most feared men eventually become irrelevant when circumstances remove them from active participation in the world they once dominated. Costello lived out his retirement in comfortable obscurity, his political connections, and carefully invested wealth, providing security that violence had never guaranteed. He maintained relationships with judges and politicians who valued his counsel even after his official retirement from criminal leadership. His death in 1973 came peacefully, at home, surrounded by the evidence of a life that had transcended its criminal origins to achieve something approaching legitimate respectability. And Lansky continued his operations with modifications required by changing circumstances and increasing government attention to gambling operations that had once enjoyed relative tolerance. His vision of an international gambling empire headquartered in Havana was destroyed by Castro's revolution in 1959, but he adapted by expanding operations in Las Vegas and the Bahamas. His death would not come until 1983, long after the world that had shaped him had transformed into something he barely recognized. The partnership that had seemed unbreakable during the golden years of the 1930s had proven as fragile as any arrangement built on mutual advantage rather than genuine affection. Genovese's ambition had exceeded his judgment, leading him to challenge an order that he had helped establish and that served his interests, even if it frustrated his ego. Costello's sophistication had ultimately protected him more effectively than violence ever could. And Lansky's intelligence, the quality that had always been his greatest asset, had allowed him to navigate challenges that destroyed less careful men. The Appalachian Summit and its aftermath revealed truths about power and organization that extended beyond their immediate circumstances. Concentrated authority invited challenge and created vulnerabilities that distributed power avoided. The commission structure, for all its limitations and frequent failures to prevent conflict, had proven more durable than any individual's attempt to dominate through force or fear. And the modernization of organized crime that the three men had pioneered, its transformation from ethnic gangs into sophisticated criminal corporations, would outlive all of them precisely because it wasn't dependent on any single leader's continued participation. As the 1950s ended and a new decade began, organized crime in America bore the permanent imprint of what Genovese, Costello, and Lansky had built together before their partnership collapsed. The structures they had created, the principles of cooperation they had established, the systems of governance they had imposed on what had been chaos. All of this survived despite their personal failures and conflicts. Their empire outlasted their partnership, which was perhaps the most fitting testament to what they had achieved and what, ultimately, their ambitions had cost them.